So let's begin. What is self-care? So what self-care really focuses on is the things that we do every single day to really take care of the relationship that we have with ourselves. What that can look like is making sure that we're really paying attention to what do we need to feel the most energized, to feel the most replenished and rejuvenated. How are we treating ourselves? Are we treating ourselves with compassion, with kindness, and with care? Because we all are very busy humans, and we can often be pulled into different directions and hold many different responsibilities, sometimes that can be draining, that can be depleting to our energy. And so by practicing self-care, that allows us the opportunity to replenish and refill and to pour back into ourselves. The other really neat component to self-care is that it's really personal, it's really unique, and we get to really decide and be the authors of what our self-care looks like, because what I might need for my self-care might look very different from what you need for your self-care. And it can be really exciting to be able to direct what our self-care plan can look like. Why does it matter? Why is self-care important? We know that self-care can really help us access a sense of mental clarity. It can help us access energy. And that can really influence how we show up in our relationships with others, as well as the relationship with ourselves. Additionally, with that being said, when we're moving through either a stressful situation or a time in our lives that is either filled with a lot of uncertainty or unknown or ambiguity, it's even more important that we prioritize our self-care, especially when we're moving through those moments, because what it can help provide is a sense of stability when we're in situations that might feel very strained, very unstable. By prioritizing our self-care, it also gives us access to that energy, because sometimes when we're navigating stress, it might ask us to show up in a different way or ask more of us. And so if we're trying to do that when we're operating from a place of empty, rather, that's going to be challenging, because we can't give anything when there's no energy there to begin with. I recognize as well that there are a lot of messages surrounding self-care, and so I definitely wanted to have some time today to really talk about those messages and kind of break them down so that we can focus on what self-care is not and what self-care actually is. I recognize that for some folks, we might have grown up with the belief that we need to tend to the needs of others before our own, rather we need to ensure that we're caring for others first, we're prioritizing others' needs first. And the challenge in that is oftentimes those actions can come at the expense of our own. So our needs can oftentimes go unmet when we're continuously prioritizing the needs of others. And that's interesting, because the opposite is actually true. When we're prioritizing our own needs, that allows us to have the energy to meet the needs of others, to pour into our relationships, to show up in our relationships. And so that is how I challenge the idea of self-care being selfish. Again, self-care doesn't have to look one certain way. It doesn't have to be super extravagant or abundant. You don't have to have a certain amount of financial resources to practice self-care. An act of self-care can be really reflecting on what your needs for rest is like. For an example, to feel rested and energized, do you need 10 hours of sleep? Do you need 8 hours of sleep? Do you need 5 hours? And looking at, are there ways that you can create shifts or structure within your days to allow yourself to access your rest needs, so you can access that sense of replenishment and rejuvenation. That's an act of self-care right there, as an example. This practice, and I call self-care, refer to self-care as a practice, because it also comes with this implication that it's something that we're doing on an everyday basis, on an ongoing basis. It's not necessarily something that we're going to be doing once and then never again, or we're going to kind of practice in the spur of the moment, spontaneous type of experience. It's something that we're really embedding within our day-to-day lives. And lastly, I know, again, I recognize we're all super busy, and I hope you're not thinking, oh my gosh, Erica, are you asking me to add another thing to my day? Stay with me. Self-care doesn't require having an abundance of time. Even if you only have 5-minute increments to really focus on yourself, on replenishing your needs, that can be super impactful, because those actions, although they might feel small, they can carry really big impacts. So know that whatever space and time that you have within your day, and the practices that you might already be doing, or the ones that you might like to begin practicing, that all counts and is incredibly valuable and impactful. So please don't feel like because you don't have a certain amount of time or free time that you can't carve out an activity that really focuses on the needs that you have. Exploring a couple of those barriers. So what can get in the way of self-care? A couple of these items I've spoken to already. However, a couple I would like to highlight is getting started, not necessarily knowing where to get started. And we're going to explore that in more depth later on, how to begin that plan of action and starting, building a self-care practice, where to get started. Another barrier that can exist is perfection. And I say that because we might see self-care look a certain way through many of the influencers that exist out there. And sometimes that might create a question in our minds or create doubt of, is what I'm practicing even self-care? Like, am I even doing the self-care? And I do want you to know that self-care isn't about perfection. And what we see out in the world on social media, it doesn't have to look like that, because again, self-care is really personal, it's really unique, and the core component is you. And so as long as it reflects what you need and it makes you feel good, that's really the end goal. So it's really important to be mindful of when perfection or an expectation of what it should look like might be getting in the way. Another barrier to self-care can be boundaries, because boundaries is an act of self-care. Oftentimes it can position us in a place where we might have to say no to something to say yes in our ability to focus on ourselves. And so depending on what our relationship with boundaries is like, that might be something that is accessible or something that's challenging for us. Also, what our self-belief is like. In order to be able to extend care to ourselves, it is important that we believe we deserve it, that we deserve to be treated with compassion, to be treated with kindness and care, not only by other folks, but by ourselves first and foremost. In beginning to look at, all right, how do I kind of weave this all together and begin establishing a practice? A couple of the additional points I like to mention is that as we continue to connect to our self-awareness, that will also help guide what our self-care looks like, because it's not something that is static, it's quite fluid. So know that as you grow and evolve, those changes and shifts are going to be reflected in what your self-care practice looks like. So what it looks like today might look differently 6 months from now or a year from now. And that's okay. As long as we're able to stay connected to how our needs change over time, that's going to ensure that we're in a place where we're able to adjust and pivot when things need to change, because we're in a different time or space in our lives. All the benefits of self-care. Again, we know that I want to really mention that life happens. And so again, it's not about perfection. There might be, for an example, deadlines that get in the way, or maybe there's a test or examination or a paper you're working on for your studies that keeps you up later or past that optimal time for you. And that's okay. I think the ask that comes with self-care is making sure that we're getting back to our practice at that next opportunity. So when we're able to go back and focus on those activities that pour into us, that's what matters, because I recognize that what we're able to commit to when it comes to taking care of ourselves is going to look different each day. It may not look the same, and that's also absolutely okay as well. I also want to mention and kind of maybe throw out there, what does it mean when our self-care is absent? Because I know I've emphasized that self-care is important. However, let's talk about, can we get by if we have no self-care? And what could that possibly look like or mean? And what that can mean is that we're operating from a place of empty. So going back to that kind of first visual where the gas tank is full, so our energy tank is empty. And we might be able to get by operating from that place for a certain while. However, what we know for certain is that we're going to reach a place of a burnout. It's not a matter of if, it's more of a matter of when. When are we going to get there? And so that's why self-care is important, because it helps prevent us entering that place of burnout and experiencing those impacts and outcomes that happen once we're there in that space. Let's explore how we can begin to develop our self-care practice. So I invite you to take an inventory of your day. I think this activity is really neat because it kind of allows us to take a look at what a typical day is like for us from the outside in. And so I invite you to make a list of everything that you do today, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, everything and anything. And from there, I invite you to identify what are the activities that you do in your day that either help you feel energized or allow you to feel nourished, that kind of pour into you. And then also identify the activities that you feel might be depleting or draining. And then lastly, identifying the things that make you feel that don't necessarily tip the balance either way, that kind of neutral. And take a step back and look at your day from a different perspective. I invite you to reflect on what that experience is like for you when you really sit down and see everything that you do in a day and how everything also impacts you energetically. From there, we can also reflect on, is there anything that you noticed or surprised you? Is there anything that stands out to you? Ask some questions you can percolate on, in addition to, is there anything that you would want to see different anything you'd want to see more of or less of once you're able to kind of spend that time in reflection on what your day actually looks like and feels like from an energetic place. Moving into how we can get started in building a self-care practice, again, we're really going to focus on starting small because we know small actions have big impacts, and we really want what we practice to fit into our days. We want it to be sustainable. We want to be able to commit to those activities that we schedule. But like I mentioned before, there are not a lot of rules when it comes to self-care, except one. I know there's just this one I need to mention, and that rule is whatever you choose to do self-care, whatever you choose to do for your self-care, it should refuel you. It should make you feel more energized, more replenished. So if you're practicing something and it's either making you feel stressed or anxious, that's a good indication of that activity possibly no longer serving you. And if that's the case for you, it's absolutely okay to switch things up, try something new, and really explore whether or not what you did practice in the past for self-care is continuing to resonate with you, because as you mentioned before, it might be an indication that you've grown, you've evolved, your needs have changed, and so having some time to reflect and trying out new activities that might have that refuel impact for you is also a really great component to have in the reflection of your practice. These are some examples of physical self-care. I wanted to spend some time really identifying the connection the physical and the mental can have. So oftentimes when we're practicing something for our physical body, we're also taking care of our mental selves as well. That really helps highlight the fact of what we choose to take care of ourselves. It can have a really beneficial impact in many different spheres or in many different areas, which is why it's so important to me to celebrate everything that we do to take care of ourselves, because it's likely that one activity is taking care of multiple different areas in our lives, or is taking care of multiple needs that we might have. Again, to also remind you, if by hearing me speak about self-care and you're thinking about your day or thinking about an activity that you might have in your action plan as self-care, is making you feel kind of like, oh, I'd rather be doing anything else. If self-care starts to feel like a chore, that's also a sign that it might be time to switch things up and try something new. It can also be really helpful to have a variety of activities, a variety of tools and things in our self-care toolbox, which we'll explore in a little bit, that we can do alone, but also that we can do in connection with other folks, whether that's our family or friends, our partners or spouses, because we have different needs, and having a variety to choose from in our planning can help account for what our needs might be given that day, space, or time. I wanted to really step out of, or rather include, some different areas of care that might not get the spotlight as often. I find that we focus on physical, mental, and emotional forms of self-care, and those are incredibly, incredibly important areas. And I wanted to add on to that and include other areas where we can also reflect on what care looks like for ourselves, in addition to those, whether that's exploring spiritual forms of activities that resonate with us, social, financial, because I really wanted us to invite that idea of having a variety of things that resonate with us, that we can practice and include in that toolbox. Okay. Let's talk about that toolbox. This really weaves into where to get started, that question, and how do we begin? And have you ever experienced when somebody asks you, what do you do for fun, or what brings you joy? And in that moment, it's kind of like, I don't know. But you do know. There are things you do that bring you joy and that bring you pleasure. But in that moment, it's almost like our minds kind of draw a blank. This activity is to help kind of like move through that stuckness that can come up in those moments. And with that being said, I invite you, if you're in a place where you're reflecting on where do I get started, to set a timer for 3 minutes and brainstorm everything that you can think of that you like to do that gives you or provides you with a sense of calm or relaxation, that make you happy or feel good. And if you get stuck, a gateway to that can help move through that stuckness can be to reflect on your senses. And by that I mean, think about, are there things that you like to see or touch or listen to or taste, or I think I missed one, see, that can help move through some of that stuckness and for you to generate a lot more ideas of what you already practice, or the things that you already do when engaging in this brainstorming process. From there, we're going to refine our results and really identify what we can do under 5 minutes, under 30 minutes, about an hour, and then over an hour. And what this helps capture is, when we go back to that list we put together, that typical day that we put together, that allows us to take some of these activities that resonate with us, which we know have a positive impact for us, and to reflect on what do I have space for in my day. Maybe that looks like, okay, during my lunch break, I have space for a 10-minute walk or a 5-minute walk. Or maybe between classes, I have space for a 5-minute walk. Or maybe in the morning, I have time for a 10 or 5-minute stretch. Depending on what a typical day ends up looking like for you, it might really prompt you to think about, okay, if the majority of my day I'm feeling really drained and depleted, how can I incorporate some activities that can counteract that for me in terms of that energetic depletion, so that I'm not moving towards that place where I'm operating on empty. Again, in this exercise on the self-care toolbox, our self-care might look different depending on the day. However, this can be a really useful tool to think about, given the time increments that we can commit to, what activities can I kind of slot in on a daily basis to make sure that I'm planning ahead, that I'm being really intentional about what am I going to do for my self-care, so that I'm not trying to figure that out in the moment, because that can be really challenging sometimes. Having a plan can also keep us accountable, and it can take away the thinking work from it, because we know what works and it's already there and outlined for us. Self-care and boundaries. I know when we started, I mentioned that self-care and boundaries are closely linked, and boundaries can be seen as a form of self-care. And Why that is the case is because when we're able to practice self-care through setting boundaries, it allows us to kind of adjust or fine-tune our hearing. Because sometimes when there are asks of us rather, or requests of us, sometimes we might find that the only way we can answer is yes. However, when we work on creating boundaries, that can also create another possible answer of no. And what that presents is a choice. We can choose whether we're going to answer yes or no. It doesn't necessarily mean there's only one answer anymore. To further build on boundaries, I wanted to really use an example that might resonate with you, that I'm hoping rather resonates with you. Think about being on a street with about like 3 different houses that are back to back next to each other, and each home is separated by their property line, which is pretty standard. The first house has a wall in front of it. And so I imagine you're thinking, okay, Erica, there's a house, there's a wall in front of it. How do I get in? That's it exactly. So we know that in order to get into that house, it's going to be incredibly difficult. There might be someone every now and then that's able to climb up that wall and get into that house. However, for the most part, we know that it's rare that someone's getting in there. That can describe having very rigid or more firm, super firm boundaries. Next door to that house, there's another home. And this home doesn't have any exterior fence. There's no wall. There's nothing preventing entry into this house. If you imagine what that could mean, is that anyone can get in. Anyone who's either hanging out in the street, they can get into the house. They can stay as long as they want. They're overstaying their welcome. That could be an example of having either a lot looser boundaries. Next door to that house is another home, and that home has a fence and a gate, and that gate locks, which is a really crucial, important feature. Why that is important is because that fence helps provide or helps serve as a source of protection. And that gate as well provides us with an option to choose who gets into our house. It also empowers us to let things go or to exit what's no longer serving us or what we no longer want in our house. Because the one thing about our boundaries is that it can change. And so if we're in that house with the fence and the gate and the lock, that means when we do want to lock that gate and prevent someone from getting in, we can do that. However, we can also unlock the gate and open it up and let folks into our house whom we want to be there. And with that being said, we all need a fence and a gate and a lock. In addition to that, it doesn't necessarily mean because we have boundaries, there are going to be folks who are still waiting outside that fence and wanting entry and not understanding why they can get in. What that means is when we have boundaries present in our lives, it can decrease the likelihood that folks are going to try to challenge them. However, that's not guaranteed. Having that gate and that lock also allows us to uphold the boundaries and uphold what we need for ourselves. Before we move into questions, I just wanted to spend a bit of time exploring emergency self-care, because we have been spending more time speaking about self-care that we can practice on a daily, ongoing basis. And I did also want to mention the benefit of having an emergency self-care plan. And this is specific to those times when we're either in crisis or we're experiencing a high level of distress. It can be very beneficial to have an emergency action plan of the activities that are helpful for us, that has the names as well as the numbers of our support and safe people, our supportive and safe people, or our therapeutic supports as well. Because in that moment, when we're in crisis or in a situation that's highly stressful, our thinking brains, or the part of our brains that are really equipped to problem solve and to develop plans and to figure out solutions, it's offline, it's not accessible. And so if we don't establish these plans in advance, it can be really challenging to come up with them in the moment when we're in a moment of crisis, thinking about, okay, what's helpful for me to do in this moment in time, because that part of my brain is not aligned, not accessible. In addition to including what's helpful, it can also be valuable to include what's harmful. What are those things that might be better to avoid? And that can be people, places, and things that might impact where you're already at in a way that could be negative. Again, having this written down, maybe in your phone, someplace that's accessible to you, can really help keep you on track and help you stay connected to those activities and resources that you know are really helpful and are beneficial to you in order to move through that period of time, that space, that situation that you're in the most optimal way. Okay, thank you so much for staying with me. I wanted to pause and take a moment to open up the virtual space to our attendees on the call and to check in to see whether or not there are any questions that have come up for folks so far throughout the webinar. I'm also going to take a moment to check the chat to see if there are any questions that have been put there. Okay. All right, no questions. That's all good. Know that if there are questions that come up later on for you, later on this week, later on today, I'll include my contact information so you're able to connect with me if that's the case, because I welcome any and all questions. Okay, before we wrap up our webinar today, I wanted to explore a couple of key takeaways and key points to leave you with from our discussion on self-care, to further reflect on, marinate on, maybe keep in your back pocket as you further digest everything we've discussed. And one of that, firstly, that includes remembering to say yes to things that align with your priorities and that bring you joy and satisfaction. Remembering or reminding folks that it's okay to say yes to what you need for you. That doesn't necessarily have to come with an explanation, that you deserve to prioritize your needs. Being intentional with your self-care and making a plan, as opposed to thinking about what to do in that spur of that moment, that spontaneous way. Planning your self-care, going back to that typical day, going back to those activities that you might already be practicing and looking at what fits, especially after reflection of what your self-care needs. What are those activities that I can input into my day-to-day schedule as it stands currently? We can allow you to make room for activities that help nourish and help replenish you, because that is going to help you so much in your ability to show up in your responsibilities in your relationships as well as within yourself. And then lastly, to remind you that when you are engaging in your care practices, working to engage in with them with connection to your body and your mind, your whole self. And I say that because, sometimes we can move through our day from a space of autopilot. And by that, I mean, we're not fully present. We're kind of there, but not sort of at the same time. Allow yourself permission, give yourself permission when you're participating in or engaging in something that brings you joy. Be there, absorb it, take it all in, because you deserve that. We've come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you so much again. I am so appreciative of this opportunity to host this webinar for you today and for you taking the time out of your day to be here with me. Let's stay connected. Again, if anything comes up for you afterwards, please feel free to reach out. I can be reached at wellness@gar.me. We have some other exciting programming coming up later on this month and the next. So if you're connected already to our social platforms, keep an eye out. And yeah, remember to take good care of yourselves. Thank you so much.